I'm Scott Lucas. This is World Unfiltered. In season 1 of World Unfiltered last year, we talked an awful lot about what we considered to be a serious situation in Turkey, politically, economically, and socially. But if a week is a long time in politics, a year can feel like an eternity. Just before Christmas, to open up season 2 of World Unfiltered, we talked to 3 specialists who were inside Turkey about what they were experiencing in the country, what they foresaw for 2022. But even since that discussion in the last few weeks, well, the situation has moved on. The Turkish lira almost halved in value in a matter of days, spurred by President Erdoğan's takeover of the central bank and arguably takeover of fiscal and monetary policy, including, rather than raising interest rates to protect the Turkish currency, well, lowering interest rates. Then, in a sudden switch of policy, perhaps out of desperation, and perhaps with a mysterious injection of foreign reserves, well, the lira suddenly strengthened. But, and you probably guess where we're going here, in the last 2 weeks, it's starting to weaken again, and it's still down about 70% on its value from where we were last month. This has been accompanied, as we have seen with the replacement of the head of the central bank, by an apparent attempt by President Erdoğan to centralize power even more than he has in recent years. We have had ongoing crackdowns on opposition figures, on journalists, on the media, but we also have in effect the question as to whether technocrats, skilled players in the skilled experts in the government are being replaced by Erdogan's men. And that raises the real question as to whether we even make it to elections in 2023. But I'm a little bit ahead of myself. As we consider a Turkey which has an inflation of 36% as we enter 2022, and it's likely to go higher, is this really a crisis? Not for President Erdogan, but for all Turks. To answer that question, we're going to go outside Turkey to 2 people who are specialists on Turkey, but they have moved across the world to see Turkey from different perspectives. And I want to draw from their expertise then, looking Turkey at home and abroad. Lisel Hintz is assistant professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's the author of a fantastic book, Identity Politics Inside Out, National Identity, Contestation, and Foreign Policy in Turkey, to get down to what makes a foreign policy at the level of culture as well as politics. She's now considering state-society interaction through the lens of popular culture. And later on, as part of our discussion, we're going to be asking her whether pop culture can in fact fuel a Turkish opposition, or whether in fact Erdogan will repress pop culture, as he has indeed repressed other media and expression in the country. Nicholas Danforth, analyst, author, recent book in June, The Remaking of Republican Turkey, Memory and Modernity Since the Fall of the Ottoman Empire. A great historical work which offers food for thought for this century. He's a writer for numerous international publications. He is connected with a number of outstanding institutions, perhaps foremost amongst them, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, as well as Brookings, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the Woodrow Wilson International Center, and the Bipartisan Policy Center. In July, he wrote about Turkish foreign relations amidst, well, crisis or non-crisis, saying that we had a period of cool, cautious calm between Turkey and the United States. I'm going to be asking him whether that's still true. But for the moment, folks, I want to get back to the big, broad question and let you go wherever you want to, whoever wants to jump in. Is crisis the right word? Because it's used a lot and for many different countries, many different. Is crisis truly the right word to describe where we are with Turkey in January 2022?
Sure, I'll jump in and say absolutely. I think, crisis in terms of crisis of governance, crisis, financial crisis, currency crisis, unemployment crisis, social crisis, all kinds of different ways in which we could slice that. We have a history of economic crises in Turkey, and often people looking at the lira today, are saying, oh, it feels like the 90s, or, oh, are we heading towards 2001 again? So there's a lot of analogies. There's a lot of looking back at, is the current crisis kind of mirroring previous crises? Although I would say the current situation, the political situation is quite different. We're not talking about, an unstable coalition government. We're not talking about a lot of the different factors that shaped the 90s. We're talking about an incredibly consolidated executive presidency with a huge reach of the leader, of President Erdoğan. People have been talking about a forthcoming economic crisis in Turkey since 2015, 2016. We kind of keep waiting to see, when is it going to explode? What's the tipping point? How do we know when it's a crisis? So kind of quantifying when the crisis begins and ends and what it looks like, I think, is quite difficult. But when you look at the numbers that you foregrounded, right, the 36% inflation rate over the last year, the unemployment figures in double digits, the fact that people can't get jobs, that the university students, that Gen Z, which is a tremendous proportion of the population at this point, doesn't know who to vote for, has no faith in government, and so forth. The fact that Turkey hosts more refugees than any other country in the world and is unable to provide education and employment opportunities for them as well. There's so many ways in which we could focus on how this is a crisis, but I think it's definitely the right word to use.
Nicholas?
Yeah, I'd follow up on that by saying, as someone who makes no claim to understand economics, but tries to follow what people who do have been saying, as Lisel pointed out, the economic situation has been worsening steadily for at least 5 years. And throughout that whole time, people have been predicting that at a certain point, this will become unsustainable. At a certain point, there really will be a dramatic crisis, a complete economic meltdown. And the longer that's gone on without happening, it almost reminds me of the way people talk about the prospects of a major earthquake in Istanbul. The longer it doesn't happen, the more convinced some people become that means it's never going to happen and the fears were overblown. And the more convinced other people become, and I tend to be pessimistic and lean on this side, that just means that when it finally does happen, it's going to be even worse than anticipated. And seeing what happened in December, seeing how the government tried to arrest the spike in the lira, and seeing the concerns that economists have about the methods they use and the sustainability of the methods they use, again, with the caveat that people have been saying this for 5 years, it does seem like at a certain point, a much deeper, more dramatic crisis is going to be unavoidable.
Let me follow up with you on that, Nicholas, in terms of, you move around, you're in different think tanks around the world and positions. And from what you get from people with whom you interact outside Turkey, do you get the sense that they perceive this as a crisis in a way that they might not have said a year ago, 2 years ago, going all the way back to the failed coup attempt of 2016?
I think that from people watching in DC, it's hard to say. People, the longer it goes on, the worse it gets, the more alarmed people get. But there's never, even in the last month or so, you heard people who weren't focused on Turkey kind of would occasionally say things like, oh, it looks like a major economy in the world is going to have an unprecedented financial crisis. This is probably something we should be worried about. And they'd kind of say that. And then it seemed like then things died down in Turkey a little bit and everyone moved on. It seems like there's an abstract sense that something really alarming could be on the verge of happening, but that, people are distracted. There's a lot of other crises going on in the world. And, in DC, at least beyond the Turkey-focused community, I think the sense is that, when the crisis happens, people will worry about it. But until then, it's in the back of their heads at best.
Yeah. When you get President Erdoğan jumping in on Kazakhstan, you could arguably say he's looking for other crises to divert us as well. Lisel, you raised a really interesting point about the fact that, in contrast to the 90s and arguably the switch between military and civilian going back for 40 years before that, the difference here is we've had a person who has been in power now for 2 decades and who has consolidated that power, even if you do have, a range of opposition parties. Does that consolidation of power in in contrast to the coalition governments, does it actually provide a buffer against a final showdown? Does it actually defer that crisis in a way, or does it just simply mean that when the crisis hits, it's going to be even more magnified because it's not just the fracturing of a coalition government, it's the toppling of, the head of a system who has been there for 20 years?
I think that's an important point to consider, and it depends on what the fallout of that crisis looks like, right? So if the fallout of the crisis is an ever increasing authoritarian consolidation where we finally move away from this question of whether Turkey's a democracy or not, and we move into full authoritarianism, I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but if that's an outcome, then we are dealing with a very, very different type of a political regime. If the crisis is that, I mean, I do expect, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, I do expect Erdoğan to use all of the tools in his toolbox to try and remain in power whenever the elections happen, whether that's falsifying elections or rewriting the rules of elections or calling a state of emergency or whatever that looks like. But if it is the case that he somehow leaves power for whatever reason, that his party leaves power, and I think it's worth noting that he himself gets higher numbers than his party does. There's a very personalistic nature to his charisma, to his leadership, to how people believe in what he can do for the economy, for politics, for society, and so forth. But if that is removed, then you have a vacuum that we don't necessarily know what that's going to look like. And it's also going to depend on what the nature of that transition looks like. Is it a violent transition? Is there actually some kind of, uprising? The words that Erdoğan has been using even earlier this week, kind of maybe foreshadowing, oh, it looks like they're going to, take to the streets. And if they do, well, they can expect a crackdown like they saw in the 2016 uprising. Like, one doesn't know if he's foreshadowing this or if he's fomenting this. But there's a real possibility that there could be violence in the streets, I think. And Turkey has a history of that. We're not at the state that we were in the 1970s in terms of the left-right clashes. But all that to say, the nature of the transition, the reaction of the regime, and sort of what replaces it will shape how that crisis, and if that crisis is mitigated. So if you do have, in the best possible outcome, say, and I don't mean this necessarily politically, but in terms of stability, if you have like an opposition coalition government that comes in, and they're able to kind of, move away from this unorthodox economic policy, they're able to move away from these aggressive foreign policy movements that are scaring investors and worrying the US and all those kinds of things. If they just kind of calm things down for a moment, then they can't avoid a crisis because it's been building for so long, and there's huge structural problems that are behind it, but they maybe can be able to mitigate it. So it's really going to depend on a number of factors that are hard to predict.
And one of those, just very quickly run this past you, can that coalition in a best possible scenario include the party that represents Turkish Kurds, the HDP, or is that beyond the pale, even for some type of alternative to Erdogan?
It's a really difficult question. And again, it depends on the extent to which Erdogan is able to use nationalism, even to the point of, another Turkish intervention in northern Syria, for example, to try to drive a wedge between the HDP, the Kurdish the People's Democratic Party, the pro-Kurdish party, and the opposition. That's I think where he has his best advantage, because he saw the effects of what can happen when the Turkish opposition parties partner with the pro-Kurdish party in the 2019 mayoral elections, when they were able to take Istanbul, when they were able to take some of these metropolitan municipalities in the West. So he has an interest in trying to prevent that from happening. And we see both domestic and foreign policy gambits that are aimed at that. We see the attempt to try to close. There's a closure case against the HDP right now. Members of parliament, members of the party, mayors have been removed, arrested, and so forth. So there's a very concerted attempt to try to prevent that from happening that we see the regime engaging in. But even outside of that, there's still a strong Kurdish antipathy amongst a lot of the Turkish nationalist opposition parties, particularly the E party, Meral Akşener's party, that would make it very difficult to reach out to pro-Kurdish or Kurdish voters. So the AKP is doing a good job of poking that very sensitive and sore point and making it difficult for those opposition parties to come together as a cohesive bloc.
Oh man, the kaleidoscope just gets bigger and bigger as we try to turn it. I want to shift a little bit to the economic sphere. And Nicholas, I know you issued the disclaimer immediately. Let's not go deep on economy, but I want to ask you more about the politics around economy. and that is at the start of 2021, when the Biden administration came in, we were talking on World Unfiltered about the possibility of U.S. sanctions through CAATSA against Turkey because of its purchase of S-400 missiles from Russia. That sort of simmered, hasn't really come to a head yet. Are we actually looking at a different scenario in 2022 where you think the United States and other powers will intervene to prop up the Turkish economy and thus prop up Erdoğan, in a way, giving him a way out if things do worsen this year?
Yeah, I'd say a few things about that. I mean, one, getting back to some of the points Lisel made, part of what matters for Erdogan's political future isn't just the state of the economy, but the narrative about the economy, and who people, hold responsible for the state of the economy, and whether they believe Erdogan's narrative about why the economy is in such bad shape. And what stands out now, in the summer of 2018, you had a rapid devaluation of the Turkish lira, but of course it came immediately after President Trump tweeted that he was going to try to destroy the Turkish economy. So in that case, it was actually very easy for Erdogan to turn to his voters and say, look, the reason the economy is having trouble is because the United States government's trying to destroy it. In this particular case, it does seem increasingly clear, it's sort of unavoidably clear, that it is Erdogan's decisions that are driving the economic crisis that Turkey is facing. And so I do think that makes it much more difficult for him to put the blame on anyone else. And I think that shapes how the politics of this play out. And I think it's, a credit to the Biden administration that basically they haven't been trying to get involved. They've, things have been calm. Turkey has not been, for the most part, trying to pick fights with the United States, and the United States has not been trying to pick fights with Turkey. And at the point where Erdogan is single-handedly destroying the economy himself, I don't think there's any reason for the United States to try to pile on sanctions, which, wouldn't necessarily, at best would simply push Turkey over a cliff economically in a way that's not actually good for the rest of the world. And at the same time would simply give Erdogan an excuse for a crisis that he's already been making. Get to the thrust of your question, I mean, right, you raised the issue, for so long we've been talking about the United States or the European Union putting sanctions on Turkey. The problem, as we're now seeing in the limits of that strategy, is that the United States and Europe would also be terrified if it really looked like Turkey's economy was going to collapse, for some idealistic reasons, because they don't want to see that happen to Turkey, but for much more cynical reasons. They care deeply about stability. The European Union is upset enough with having Syrian and Afghan refugees come through Turkey. They'd be even more upset about having Turkish refugees coming to Europe. So in that sense, I think Erdogan would have a certain amount of, essentially by destroying the economy himself, he has a kind of get out of jail free card on sanctions because he knows that the rest of the world can't try to sanction him when the economy is already going downhill. It is also strange, one of the things, the sanctions that the United States has always discussed is putting conditions on whether Turkey could get an IMF loan. And the IMF has its own set of conditions for whether Turkey could get a loan, many of which would be quite difficult for Erdogan in his current configuration to fulfill. And Erdogan, for his own part, has also said that he's not going to seek IMF support. And so if you got to a situation where, there really was an unprecedented economic crisis, a situation where any other government would turn to, international lenders, the IMF, the question is at that point, I think a lot of Europeans, some Americans are thinking that's going to be their moment of leverage. That's going to be their moment when Erdogan turns to them in desperation. They hold the financial cards and they get to decide, what Erdogan has to do to get a loan. Erdogan has shown that that's not necessarily the logic he's following. Erdogan has shown that, when it comes to how he's handled interest rates, he does not necessarily see the same things as being obligatory that international economists expect him to. And so, that raises real questions about how a serious crisis would play out. And one of the most alarming things I've heard people say, and I'll close here, at some level for Erdogan, he has another year until he has to have elections. From his, self-interested political perspective, a serious crisis that happens before elections that, gives him a chance, that upends politics, gives him a chance to consolidate power, and deepen his control over the country could be better for him politically than simply limping into elections in 2023 with an economy that is very bad, but has not hit that level of complete crisis that would, in fact, give him opportunities to establish greater authoritarian control.
Well, and that leads me to go back to you, Lisel, in terms of inside Turkey. What do you see as Erdogan's economic play here? Is it the case that there's not really an economic play to get back to stability, but now, in fact, manipulating the economy to create, as it were, crisis politics all the way up to the next election?
So I think an important factor to consider here is that, so many, and I absolutely want to make the same disclaimer as Nick, I'm not a finance analyst, I'm not an economist, but I do listen to people who are very good ones and try to sort of incorporate into that into my analysis of politics. But, the most wizened and sort of the financial analysts that are following this the closest have no explanation for what Erdogan is doing. There's not a rational calculation. There's not a long term. There's not a short term. There's not a this may be sustainable. This may not. It doesn't make sense. So that's something to consider, right? And when you think about that, you want to kind of step back and look at his influence over decision making, not only with the consolidated presidency, but the way in which he's purged, and you alluded to this earlier, the way in which he's purged the technocrats, the way in which he's purged anyone who could be a potential threat to him, anyone who's not kind of telling him the things that he wants to do or is not willing to carry out the policies that he is mandating. And when you come to the point when you have such an insular circle around you that you're not getting a whole lot of good feedback, you're not making very good decisions. And so I think from foreign policy to the economy, we really need to think about what's the quality of decision making that's happening here. This credit fueled growth plan, this let's throw hot money into the economy is unsustainable. And we've been saying that as I and as Nick said earlier for quite a long time. He raised minimum wage by 50% last month. But when you have inflation that is causing prices of bread and other essential products, energy prices to rise precipitously, that minimum wage hike doesn't really have a whole lot of effect on purchasing power. And so because one might say, oh, minimum wage hike, okay, we're going to see early elections. Well, if you don't get the effects that you want from that, then you're not necessarily going to have a good playing field for calling elections. And that's what Erdogan is monitoring so closely. We know that he's always followed the polls. He's followed some polls, and then all of a sudden they're not telling him what he wants to hear. He stops following those polls. But he is very, very concerned about when he can have the conditions that will be conducive to a potential victory. He absolutely is thinking about, as you alluded to, economic tools that he can use to try to create those conditions for a victory. But I just don't see anything in that toolkit at this point. Even the money into the economy, the minimum wage hike, the steps that he's taking, the sort of populist policies that might be able to get you that bump in the polls, are insufficient at this point. And so while the economy may get worse later, and therefore it may be in his interest to call elections now, calling elections now is almost, if they were free and fair, which is a whole other set of questions, is not going to be successful. So, what economic play can he make? Very few tools in that toolkit at this point.
Let me link economy to foreign policy, come back to you, Nicholas, with this, which is, I find an interesting contrast here, which is, I guess, uncertainty is what we've got with the economy. Yet you have argued regarding the US and Turkey that, you have this more cool and calm period, which has taken place. Let me widen that out. I mean, arguably, Erdogan has tried to go for a more settled foreign policy. The Turks are still in Syria, but it appears that we have basically a de facto partition of the country. Libya is in its own uncertain position, but Turkey at the forefront, they seem to have pulled back just a bit. Nagorno-Karabakh, everybody's got an uneasy settlement there. But I'm also interested in the big players. He makes his appeal to the Russians. And of course, not only is he still linked up with Qatar as one Gulf state, all of a sudden the UAE, who had been the rival of the Turks, pops up in Ankara at the end of last year, bringing $10 billion in investment, by the way. And so it looks like Erdogan's playing nicely with everybody in the Middle Eastern playground. are we actually seeing a more settled foreign policy from Erdoğan, despite or possibly because of the situation inside the country?
Right. I mean, I think there are domestic and foreign policy dynamics at work, as you alluded to. Right, since 2016, people in Ankara have been very candid about the fact that Turkey was launching a much more assertive foreign policy, much more focused on hard power, using the Turkish military to shift regional dynamics to their benefit. In their mind, not completely unfairly, trying to push back against what they saw as a growing, increasingly hostile constellation of actors across the Middle East, stretching into Europe, that were trying to constrain Turkey. This, resulted in a lot of aggressive foreign policies, a lot of Turkish deployment of troops on the ground in the places you mentioned. And on one hand, this did secure some real tangible military gains in the field. Nagorno-Karabakh, obviously, Azerbaijan retook territory that it had lost to Armenia 20 years ago. They succeeded in preventing a Haftar-led offensive in Libya from capturing Tripoli, holding territory on the ground. It, for 2 years at least, managed to stop the regime's advances in Idlib. Real tangible military gains. The question has always been what the diplomatic consequences of these policies would be. I think they did result in intensifying a lot of the hostility towards Turkey that the Turkish government had been worried about. The consolidated relationship between Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, and the Gulf states, that's very real. France and Greece signing a defense pact, that's something that, was a clear result of Turkey's moves in Libya. So, the question has always been how the short-term military gains will be balanced against some of the long-term geopolitical consequences. It does seem like, driven in part by the domestic situation Erdoğan was facing, the political problems, the economic problems he found himself in, and a growing awareness of the unsustainable cost of some of these foreign policy adventures. And you could add Biden's election in last fall. There was a pivot in Turkish foreign policy towards seeking rapprochement with some of these countries that Turkey was at odds with, trying to lower temperatures across the region. I think ideally from Ankara's point of view, trying to consolidate diplomatically the gains that were made militarily. And it's been fascinating to watch this. In part, I think, some of the optimism, particularly that was promoted by Ankara at the outset of this process, where they made it sound like they were going to have a reset with the United States, they were going to be solving all their problems instantaneously, was oversold, was exaggerated, was not in keeping with the way officials in other countries were talking about their relationship with Turkey. But we've seen slow progress over the past year. Improvements with Egypt have not gone as fast as the Turkish side predicted, but there has been a lowering of temperatures. The Libyan peace process did not lead to new elections, but it has not broken down into civil war, and people seem to be eager to hold the peace even though elections haven't happened. Turkey and Greece are in talks, which no one takes seriously when it comes to solving any of these problems, but people prefer talks to being on the verge of a naval confrontation. And then with UAE and Saudi Arabia, there has been some real tangible progress, in part because those countries are reevaluating their foreign policy, in part because, you have authoritarian leaders in all these countries that realize that maybe getting along could be better for them domestically. So I got to sum this all up by saying, so far, so long as Erdogan's domestic goal seems to be keeping things stable, keeping the economy from getting out of hand, maintaining calm relationships with the region, I'm not expecting any breakthroughs. I don't think regional dynamics are going to change dramatically. The enemies that Erdogan has created will stay, will remain suspicious of him, will remain eager to work with one another to contain Turkey. But it's good to see the temperature lowered. Washington is certainly relieved by that. I think everyone in the region is relieved by that. Hopefully that will continue. The only concern is if the domestic situation in Turkey changes and suddenly Erdogan sees, if the international circumstances become too hostile, if the détente that Erdogan has reached with some of these countries breaks down for any reason, or the domestic situation leads him to again prioritize confrontation over détente, things could get ugly again. But for now, better than it was a year ago.
Lisel, how much does foreign policy, either in substance or in rhetoric, play out in terms of for Erdogan on the domestic scene? How much does he really gain from it? And I ask that because clearly at certain times he's jabbed at the Europeans, he's jabbed at the Dutch, he's jabbed at the Germans, he's jabbed at the French. We've seen Turkey try to proclaim success in Syria, in Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh. We've even seen Turkey try to claim credit that they were going to be the power that was going to restore stability to Kabul airport, if not necessarily all of Afghanistan. How much of that do you think really is playing in terms of Erdogan's domestic position, shoring it up amidst the economic issues?
So it's very difficult to gauge exactly what, a bump in the polls is stemming from, or what effect a particular foreign policy jab has. So I won't pretend to be able to quantify, like, okay, if he is, calling the Germans Nazis and, following the ban of sending Turkish diplomats to campaign in Germany, what's that going to do for his polls back home? So I won't pretend to be able to kind of slice it from a quantitative perspective, but what we can see is that this kind of strong man punching out at these powerful enemies, particularly against the United States. I would say that we see that he gets his biggest sort of nationalist swell of popularity when he is standing up against the United States, or Israel, I should say. And as Nick was pointing to earlier, we're seeing a cooling of tensions, or at least an attempt by Ankara to try to repair some of those relationships, like with Israel, with UAE, with Egypt, and so forth. But Israel and the United States are two punching bags that Erdogan could kind of reliably count on to be able to get some domestic support. The important thing to consider about sort of pushing back at the United States is to understand the coalitions that Erdogan needs to be able to keep supportive of him. And by criticizing the United States for interfering in Turkey's ability to purchase its own missile defense system of its own choosing, for example, right? So saying the US wouldn't sell us Patriots, we had to go with the S-400s, and also it's our sovereign choice to do so, and the United States should not be able to constrain our ability to purchase the weapons that we want. That not only plays to his pious base, which may, for example, react more strongly when he pushes back at Israel over its treatment of Palestinians, for example, with that Sunni connection. And Erdogan portraying Turkey as sort of the protector of Sunni Muslims globally, but particularly the Palestinian population. But when he's pushing at the United States, he also, there's a reaction from all sorts of nationalists, of those who are frustrated with the United States's attempts to try to curtail labor unions in the 70s, right? There's all kinds of leftist nationalists, secularist nationalists, ethnic nationalists, religious nationalists that are frustrated with the United States' what they would look at as cultural imperialism, or sort of attempts to try to rearrange the Middle East in ways that are conducive for the US economy. So all that to say, there's a lot of political capital to be gained by these sorts of rhetorical punches at the US or the EU or some of these other countries that can play to a wider base than just his narrow, say, pious, reliable electoral base. I think it's also important to consider that identity politics, this us versus them kind of dynamic that he's able to construct, and to sort of position Turkey as this counter hegemon, right? So he's famous for saying the world is bigger than five, right? It's not just the 5 UN Security Council permanent members. We should also have a voice. And by we, I also mean my Muslim brethren and my other countries that have not had a seat at the world's negotiating table. So all of those kinds of forms of identity politics are materially, not in the broader sense of things, but materially much cheaper than tangible economic handouts. So when he wants to rile his nationalist base, he can engage in these rhetorical gambits, these sort of us versus them dynamics, in ways that can galvanize his base temporarily and maybe only to a limited extent, but in ways that don't cost him. When the coffers are empty, us versus them dynamics can be pretty effective.
Wow. So much to follow up on, but I wanted, having put Erdogan at the center of our discussion, I want to put him to the side to a bit and realize there are other people in Turkey and there are other groups. I want to talk a little bit about whether it's oppositional politics, resistance politics, and not just at the party level. And Lisel, I want to kick off with you, and then Nicholas, get your reaction from Washington on this. You've written a lot about identity politics, Lisel, but of course not just from Erdogan, from different groups in Turkey. And now you're writing about a cultural politics, including pop culture and politics. How much space is there in Turkey, given what we saw in 2013 with the repression of the Gezi Park protest, given by the attempt after 2016 by Erdogan to narrow political culture after the failed coup attempt? How much space is there for a cultural politics, an oppositional cultural politics, or can Erdogan just simply shut that down the way that he's attempted to shut down other forms of expression in media?
So it's a great question, and I think we have to answer it by starting with, how much space is there for this type of cultural politics? Well, when you've closed off the streets to protest, when you have police crackdowns on all kinds of peaceful protest, from the Saturday mothers gathering in Istanbul to protest the disappearance of their Kurdish sons, to the Boğaziçi students who are angry at the imposition of an AKP lackey as a rector. All kinds of peaceful protest in Turkey on the streets are being met with police violence and arrests and all kinds of other punitive measures that are not just about those protests, but are trying to send a larger message of intimidation. Don't think you can go out in the streets because this is what's going to happen to you. So it's important to see that larger context. When that's closed off, cultural politics, cultural sort of digital culture as a medium of communication, of signaling that you're not alone, of signaling that resistance still exists, of signaling that we can symbolically take Erdogan down a peg by making fun of him, that we can form a collective identity as an opposition by coming together and sharing jokes and expressing grief and rage and so forth through various forms of cultural media shared mostly on social media. And I'll get to the ways in which the AKP can curtail that in a second, does become sort of a medium of collective identity formation, of resistance, of politics itself. So it's important to think of the opposition using culture as a space of resistance in counterposition to the AKP trying to sort of use culture as a form of nation building itself. So if you look at the many restrictions that they've put on what can be shown on television, alcohol is banned on television. There are numerous restrictions that come from the Supreme Board of Radio and Television, but formal restrictions aside, if you look at the political economy of the media in Turkey, 90 to 95% of the television stations are owned by holding companies that have very strong political and financial ties to the AKP. So there's a way of constricting what kind of culture is appropriate and what kind of identity is appropriate that's being disseminated on television. So the opposition tries to use culture as a platform to push back against that. To try to express their own voice, to try to raise up perspectives that aren't on those national media stations and so forth. So using rap music videos, using graffiti, using memes, using social media as a way to disseminate these messages of dissent, while they don't necessarily have a change at the regime level yet, can signal that this opposition still exists and that it's not going anywhere. Now, what I mentioned earlier, the tough part about that is the way in which the AKP has recognized that social media is this arena of contestation, of solidarity building and so forth. And so, people are arrested for tweets. People are arrested for retweeting tweets. There are new data localization laws in place, which means that companies like Facebook and Twitter and so forth have to have a branch within Turkey that can then be monitored and so forth. So there's definitely an attempt to try to curtail that and crack down on it, but creative resistance will always find a way. And it may not see us looking at a regime change in the near future, but it does kind of create that base for when people finally get out into the street, they have a sense of collective identity. They have a sense of resistance that can kind of perpetuate that momentum and keep them in the streets with the kind of humor that we see used, even when they're facing the violence that they saw in the Gezi Park protests, for example.
Wow. I want to riff off that with you, Nicholas, and I want to go a little bit. Quite often when we talk about how the U.S. and Europe react to this, we talk about questions of whether they will defend human rights, which is important, and so on. But I think that's a pretty straightforward sort of stand back at this point. My question is a little bit more a sensitivity to that type of cultural dynamics that Liesel's talking about, because it reminded me this actually was in the air in 2009, how the incoming the new Obama administration was going to interact with the mass movement on Iranian streets. Talks about, do they use Twitter, et cetera. It was in play to an extent for a while after, North Africa and Middle East in 2011 and beyond. To what extent do you find that in the US or in Europe, there's a sensitivity to those cultural dynamics that Liesel's talking about, even if you want to make sure that you don't give the appearance that you're intervening in any way, because that, of course, will give blowback against you. The Erdogan will use that against you.
At best, and I echo all of your cynicism about the extent to which I think we'll see a very robust American defense of democracy or human rights in the world. But at best, what the United States has done, I think, is recognize that it can play a modest role in making sure, especially social media forms of opposition, of communication, remain viable in the rest of the world. And, I think this was something that Obama and Hillary Clinton, when she was at state, did to some extent, which was, in modest ways, push on, U.S. tech companies to try to make sure they weren't completely captured by foreign regimes, try to at least help America provide the digital tools to sustain a little bit of this opposition, an opposition space, a way for people to engage in the kind of activities that Lisel described. As we've seen with the Arab Spring, it's not always enough. It's certainly not always enough when, you have the United States more passive in terms of doing other things to support democracy. You could go one step further and say, even if the United States did a lot of the right things, which it hasn't done, that still might not be enough to change outcomes in foreign countries. And I think moving towards future elections in Turkey or contestation over future elections in Turkey, at least the Biden administration has differed from Trump in saying the right things and making it clear that at least nominally they're on the side of human rights and democracy. How much further they'd go than that? Let's see.
Okay. Another question we leave hanging in the air. All right, big finish. And I know we're not supposed to do this. We're supposed to be analysts. We're always supposed to basically read what we've got there. We've got to be careful of projecting. But hey, we're speaking to viewers and I need a hook. So I'm going to ask each of you. I'll start with you, Nicholas. A year from now, when I get you back here, and I do want to get you back here to talk further. When I get you back here, Nicholas, in January 2023, where will Turkey be? Will we have any type of resolution or will we still be in limbo at that point?
Look, if you'd asked me that question any time in the last 5 years, I would have had an answer for you. The answer might have been wrong, but I would have had an answer. Okay. Now, it's just what I will say, my non-answer will be, it's really remarkable talking to people in Washington, but all the more so in Turkey, there's the intensity of the divergence on this question, and that you have people who are completely convinced that in 2023, if not sooner, there will be elections, Erdogan will lose, and that will be the end of the story. And that anyone who thinks otherwise is unduly cynical, paranoid, pessimistic, etc. And you have other people, they tend to be quieter about their opinions sometimes, who are completely convinced that by hook or by crook, using machinations or violence, Erdogan will find a way to stay in power, or at least will try to stay in power in ways that will result in some truly ugly fallout, and that anyone who thinks differently is hopelessly optimistic and naive. And I don't, I'll go one step further, and this is going to be my way of then putting the question to Lisel, particularly coming at this as a historian. It's particularly difficult to answer this question because what we're seeing now are unprecedented dynamics. My research was on Turkey's transition to democracy in 1950. And when it came to Turkish elections in 1950, no one, not the governing party, not the opposition, not American observers, thought that there was going to be a democratic transfer of power. And they were all completely surprised when it happened. And so, I will only say, I don't think there's going to be one now, but I'm hoping I'm wrong, just the way people were wrong in the past. And in this case, I also don't think we as historians have particularly good insight into this. So I'm actually very eager to hear what political scientists in particular who come at this from a more comparative perspective and can bring in the experience of other countries have to say in the hopes that that will be more illuminating than what I can say.
I like that idea of finding optimism and being wrong. Lisel, can you get us out of this cul-de-sac?
Oh, Nick, you give me too much credit and you don't give yourself enough. But I do think that a comparative perspective is really useful. Look at who's lining up behind the Kazakh government right now. Look at the model of what those regimes look like. And I've used the word toolkit over and over in this discussion. And that's because in comparative politics, we talk about the authoritarian toolkit, the dictator's toolkit, the ways in which they recognize that social media can be a venue, a forum of opposition mobilization, and therefore they restrict access to it. They don't often just turn off the internet, as we've seen, as we saw actually in Iran, as we're seeing in Kazakhstan now, and so forth, either spotty or turned off completely. But they'll find ways to restrict it, or they'll criminalize the use of it in particular ways. So there are recognizable patterns of ways in which authoritarian leaders seek to quell opposition, whether they try to co-opt it, whether they try to provide safety valves at the local level, whether they try to consolidate their power by taking over politics at the local level. The direction that I see the AKP heading in, and the question, I love the way that Nick brought up, people diverge so much on sort of where Turkey is going. And I think if you actually look at kind of the demographic and professional backgrounds of those individuals, it kind of predicts which way they fall on that question. Because I think those who are sort of comparativists see this in a much more pessimistic way than say Turks who, so this is moving to the demographic side, but, are going to have hope and optimism and the belief that this can go in different ways. Today is January 7th. Yesterday was January 6th. Look at the United States, the people that didn't believe that January 6th would have or could have happened in the United States, right? So I think we kind of need to step out of our positionality and recognize that things can happen that we never thought could possibly happen. And of course, in the US, we have this exceptionalism that we write about and we talk about, but I think that's characteristic of a lot of countries. And so I definitely understand why, say, going into the 2018 presidential elections, a lot of Turks that I think I would agree on a lot of other political questions thought that maybe there was a chance of unseating Erdoğan. And I just didn't think that was going to be the case. And I think the events of what happened around the day of that election had a lot to do with that. But all that to say, I think a comparative perspective gives us the most pessimistic perspective because it shows over and over that rulers are able to use these toolkits to be able to consolidate their power, quell opposition, vilify any kind of movements against them. And that, we're seeing a global trend in that, from the rise of populist, masculine hegemonic populist authoritarian leaders to even the presence of those in Europe. So I would take the pessimistic side. I think in January 2023, we're going to be looking at elections in which the HDP may be closed or very marginalized. I think we're going to see either elections canceled or held completely under the conditions that the AKP sets. And I think that Erdoğan is going to remain in power by hook or by crook.
Stay strong, everybody. It's been a wonderful conversation with both of you when put alongside the conversation with not just simply these were Turkish scholars before Christmas, Turkish activists, and trying to find, as it were, a window of opportunity that exists. So perhaps even with the pessimism there, we keep the window of opportunity open just a crack, right, through this year, because if we haven't resolved the uncertainty, by golly, y'all have definitely illuminated the uncertainty. Lisel Hintz, Nicholas Danforth, thank you so much for joining me here on World Unfiltered. Let me thank the technical crew of Deep Dive Politics who put us all on the air on what is our first live broadcast. You can later see this if you've only caught part of it, or tell your friends. You can see it on the World Unfiltered series on the Deep Dive Politics YouTube channel. You can look us up on Facebook at Deep Dive Politics, or on your Twitter at dive_politics, or you can contact me with any questions, comments, or feedback at ScottLucas_EA. Indeed, Lisel Hintz, where can people find you on Twitter?
creatively at Lisel Hintz.
There you go. Straightforward. And Nicholas Danforth.
Nicholas Danforth without the H at the end.
Turkish pronunciation.
Exactly. So let's keep the conversation going, folks. Let me thank all of you who have tuned in live and those of you who will be seeing us on record. Hey, folks, stay safe, be decent to each other. This has been World Unfiltered.